Good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 22nd meeting of Standards, Procedure and Public Appointments Committee in 2025. I have received apologies this morning from Emma Roddick, and so can I welcome Rona Mackay, who is attending as committee substitute. Good morning, Rona. Our first item is to take evidence on the Freedom of Information Reform Scotland Bill, and we are joined this morning by Katie Clark MSP, who introduced the bill. And can I welcome to this meeting our first panel of witnesses, David Hamilton, who's Scottish Information Commissioner, I'm splitting you there, and Paul Much, who's Deputy Head of Policy and Information, Scottish Information Commissioner's Office. Good morning, gentlemen. I'm just going to kick straight off with questions, if that's all right. So in the adage of starter for 10, I suppose coming first to you, David, as Commissioner, do you want to expand why you think the primary legislation reform is needed at this stage? Nice easy opener one.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to give evidence. The Freedom of Information Scotland Act now has been enacted for 20 years, and it has delivered some tremendous results for people in Scotland. But like everything, 20 years ago, we're in a different world now. I was looking at some comparative technologies to find out, smartphones had only just become a thing with cameras and phones. Digital revolution has been extraordinary. The pace of change has been enormous. And what we need to do is sort of essentially have a kind of tightening up of the nuts and bolts to sort of just tighten up the legislation a little bit. Some things have opened up. We have different structures of governance that didn't exist before, such as arm's length organisations, and legislation has changed through designation slightly but slowly, and we're in a position now that I think we need to really look at review the whole system and just say, right, how can we make this better and make sure that we retain our place as one of the leading freedom of information regimes certainly in Western Europe, and get back up that ladder to be part of the world.
That's very helpful. Now, you've picked up on the fact that sort of the delivery of services as well as the technology has changed over the 20 years. But interestingly, the bill itself doesn't extend the scope of it. In a sense, is that a shortfall in the bill? Is the bill missing items that you would have liked to see in it about extending how freedom of information and to whom freedom of information would apply?
Well, I consider this as a bit of an infrastructure bill. So this is something that is a mechanism that allows things to happen more easily. And, I mean, designations are a great example of that. That really has been pretty appalling, the pace at which designation happens or doesn't happen. And I think that's been a big issue. And we need to be something that's more agile and flexible and actually also more accountable in terms of how we expand that designation. So that's what this bill does, is it gives a mechanism to allow things to happen, not in replacement to, but in addition to keep the pace of change moving in a more appropriate way. So, yeah, I think this is... There are other bits and pieces. To be honest, I'd like to have seen Lord Advocate and Procurator Fiscal Service being fully covered by the appeals section of Freedom of Information, because that's not in the bill, and I don't think there's a good reason for it not being.
Right. That's helpful. Thank you. If there's anything you want to add, Paul, just sort of jump in.
Yeah, well, I mean, the only thing I'd really add is that certainly, our experience has shown in the past that a sort of measured and proportionate approach to designation has been the most effective approach to take in terms of just ensuring that both we have the ability to support organisations as they prepare for their duties under freedom of information, and different sectors as they prepare for their duties. And that can be seen from the phenomenally successful designation of registered social landlords in 2019, where they're now one of our best and consistently one of our best performing sectors under the legislation. So I think just the opportunity to take that more paced and proportional approach to designation, I think, is helpful in terms of just ensuring that the rights remain as effective and robust as possible.
Yeah. And one of the things, I suppose, is this balance between primary legislation, secondary legislation, and indeed non-legislative attempts. I mean, David, do you have any comments about the balance that's been struck in this bill on that? You described the bill in a way as sort of being scaffolding for what goes forward. Are you content that that will allow us to continue to modernise with perhaps not having to wait potentially 20 years plus for another piece of legislation?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think this is the key thing here, because, you know, the designation, the codification in terms of publication, again, is another key piece of infrastructure which we can put in place here. And it means that we can move more dynamically as things happen. You know, we shouldn't have to bring legislation back to the Parliament every time something happens as a sort of a technological evolution. I mean, already we're looking at artificial intelligence, which has come on so much before this bill was even, you know, when it first started, 2022 or so, when it first got talked about. Here we are now, and it's a different world in terms of artificial intelligence in itself. So what we want to do, or I would like to see, is replicating the principles of our original bill that have stood the test of time and which are broad enough in terms of its definitions to not narrow us down into a particular area, to have principles and to have a structure which allows us to basically build on that and mean that we can adapt and move at pace and dynamically in the future.
Thank you. Annie, can I come to you? And Annie's joining us online.
Hi, sorry. Apologies, I've had a few problems with my Surface Pro this morning. Morning, and thank you for coming along. David, you stated that the designation under Section 5 is the most appropriate route, but to bring the organisations delivering public services within the scope of the FOI-SA, at the same time you express concern in written evidence that the Section 5 mechanism as currently utilised is not effective or responsive means for ensuring FOI rights keep pace with changes in service delivery. Can you explain what protections or benefits this designation procedure offers?
Well, I think the principle of the Parliament having a role in this is a really good one, or it's an additional role in it. Now, there's nothing to stop Scottish Government and Scottish ministers continuing in their existing capacity to designate and to review and take things forward. But frankly, they've not been doing it. And it's pretty preposterous, frankly, in the submission, which I saw from them, saying that they have not been going slow. If this is not slow, I don't know what slow is, because this is, you know, glacial in terms of progress. The idea that we are currently having a consultation about the care sector, which started 6 years ago, and we've just finished the consultation about the consultation about the consultation, it just gets ridiculous. And this is something that it's really not good enough. I mean, we've got a line we use in the freedom of information world, which is information delayed is information denied. Well, this is it on an organisational scale, you know, right across the whole regime. So we need to be, you know, something that we can adapt much faster to it. And if the Scottish ministers are not able to do that, for whatever reason, then maybe there should be another avenue for that and give the Parliament, give the people the opportunity to designate.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more, David, to be honest. Thank you. But also in your written submission, it was noted that the process to bring registered social landlords within scope took 13 years, and that the Scottish Government is due to consult on extending the FOI-SA to cover care homes. Have you been invited to contribute to that scope or design of the upcoming consultation on care homes? And do you have any expectations or recommendations regarding the timescale or implementation?
Well, can I maybe ask Paul to answer? Paul, much I should explain, has been in the office, you know, in the Scottish Information Commissioner's office since almost, well, from the very beginning. He's almost as old as a designation. And he's been very much involved in this side, so I'll maybe ask him to answer.
Yeah, I mean, just in response to that, I'd say that, yes, we have been involved. The Scottish Government has, I mean, this process started back in 2019 with an initial consultation about the further use of the Section 5 powers. That's kind of moved on now to the announcement of the consultation to extend to the care sector. And as part of that process, the Scottish Government has established a consultation advisory group involving representatives from the sector and a whole host of other different organisations and stakeholder interests. And we have been involved in that process in terms of helping to shape the consultation document. We are still awaiting the launch of that consultation document. I understand it's due to be fairly soon. I think the intention is to launch it within, certainly this side of Christmas, as far as I understand, but I'm sure the Minister will be able to provide more information on that. In terms of the timescales, however, obviously this process started back in 2019. We're now about to consult an extension to the care sector. In the meantime, we've had a pandemic, which, highlighted the need for greater transparency in relation to the services provided through this sector. So for us to still be here in 2025 awaiting the consultation that may potentially eventually lead to further designation, I think just illustrates the issues with the pace of designation.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. And I've got one final question, Convener, if that's okay.
Please.
Just to ask, probably David and maybe Paul wants to come in on this as well, whether you have any views on the proposals to provide Parliament with a power to designate public authorities.
Yeah, I think this is quite an interesting and quite imaginative one. It gives that ability to. I think how I would envisage that happening is that we have the same degree of consultation, not as much consultation, we don't need as much as that, but a faster degree of consultation that can be scrutinised through the Parliament's committees, probably this one, and then be put forward. And again, it should get the same amount of consideration, but actually work a bit faster on things, and again be reflective of what matters to people. And the care sector matters to people. We've seen that in all the survey responses, all the consultations, all 4 or 5 of them, whatever there is. The people want that. And the reality is that, often with these consultations, as you know, people start off in one position and they end up in the same position because the stakeholders have their views. And actually, I'm never sure how much we really get in some of the consultation responses because I don't see a lot of movement in these things. So I think we go through the process, we give the opportunity for everyone to be heard, listen to everybody, and then move on.
Thank you for that, David and Paul. I'm content, Convener, hand back over to yourself.
Thank you, Annie. If I can just explore how you envisage the role of Parliament. I mean, if we just take the current consultation period, that's 2 sessions. That's 2 different entities of this Parliament. And actually, there is a view of what the role of Parliament is. What do you think the sort of philosophical reason to give Parliament the power to designate when almost everything else sits with government and is then scrutinised by this Parliament? What are the advantages? What are the timescales? And what's the problem that we're trying to achieve? Is it that it's just taking too long to expand the designation?
I think the problem is that if the government doesn't want to, then it doesn't happen.
Right.
And I think that's part of the problem. If the government wants to, it can still happen. If the government doesn't want to, it doesn't have to vote for it. But I think what this allows is a proper discussion as to designating areas that people feel are appropriate. And it allows things to surface that, I'd feel slightly uncomfortable with the fact that something which is core to democracy and which should be so apolitical as this is something that should be tinkered with by the party of government, whoever that is. And I think this is where I see a real advantage that the Parliament can express a view on it. And it is kind of unusual, and I don't think there's a lot of precedent for it. But last time I looked, this was meant to be a new Parliament with exciting ideas, and let's push the boundaries. So why not?
Excellent, thank you. Ruth, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I've got some questions about publicly owned companies, the time for compliance, and then a brief one about independent schools this morning. Section 3 of the bill proposes a small technical amendment to the definition of publicly owned companies. We've not discussed this in our evidence session so far, and only yourselves and the Scottish Government provided any substantive views in our written consultation. For the record, can you provide any examples of companies that would fall within the revised division of publicly owned company as proposed in section 3 of the bill?
Right, so this is one of these real technical ones for, for the FOI geeks, of which I can't claim to be one. I can give you the general principle of it. So essentially what the problem we're trying to fix with this one is that companies that were jointly owned by government and by local authorities, for example, would not be covered. Paula, have you got any examples of...
I was going to say, do you have any examples of specific information requests or appeals that would illustrate the impact of that anomaly?
To be honest, I'm not aware of specific examples of these types of companies. Perhaps the Minister might be best placed to answer that question about the types of companies that are owned by the government and other public authorities. But I think fundamentally, though, what this is it's a kind of anomaly in the legislation in that companies that are wholly owned by public sector bodies right across the public sector are covered by FOI. And I think rightly so, because, these are companies that are, that are owned by public sector organisations and delivering functions on behalf of those organisations. So if it's wholly owned by a local authority, if it's covered. If it's wholly owned by 2 local authorities, it's covered. But if it's wholly owned by the ministers and another public authority, it's not covered. And I think it's that anomaly that...
Yeah, I would understand that. Have there been any specific information requests or appeals that would to your office that would illustrate the impact that anomaly has on access to information for the public? I'm
not aware of any particular appeals that we've had, but we could certainly go and look at that. But I think one of the situations in those circumstances, because they're not covered, that people requesting information may not be informed of their rights in order to go on and make an appeal. So I think that causes a bit of difficulty as well. But we can certainly go away and check in with our colleagues on the enforcement side of the building to see whether there's anything that we can provide on that.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. The proposal to pause time for compliance, both the public audit and post-legislative, that was a really bad, I'm in the wrong job to not be able to say that word, scrutiny, and the member in charge, Katie Clark, in her consultation, asked about this, and there was, positive responses to both those consultations. David, your response said that this would undoubtedly be preferable to the approach required by the current regime. The Scottish Government suggests that improved guidance for public authorities on seeking clarification could address the information or requesters' concerns about delay. We'll all have views on how helpful guidance is. Do you agree that guidance alone would resolve these issues, and what changes would you expect to see in the revised Code of Practice in terms of timing and clarification of requests?
I don't think guidance is enough, and that's because this is a world of lawyers. And, lawyers look at every single word and say we don't need to. And there's nothing really we can do about that. I think the point about the pause is really, again, to fix a problem where people are coming at the very last minute and asking for clarification, resetting the clock again. It's like snakes and ladders. It's not good. It's not good practice, but it's legal. And again, this is just a way of tightening that up. That's a good example of just getting the machine engine back serviced and working again.
Sure. Okay. Your evidence provided us with statistics that 88% of responses were provided on time last year. Does that statistic include cases where requests were clarified multiple times?
I don't think that does. So this is information that's applied by the public authorities, and I don't think going into that granular detail on the sheet.
I think those sorts of cases where clarification has been required will be included within that data, but it will be included from the time at which clarification was received in most cases, I think, because that's the time, the 20 working days would be reset, so the public authorities would then judge their compliance against that timescale. I don't think we currently ask public authorities to supply us with information around the amount of clarification requests that have been submitted, but that's maybe something that we should look at in terms of the data that we do collect from public authorities to get a better gauge on that.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, any additional evidence or data that your office holds that would help us understand if these clarification requests are being used to delay disclosure would be helpful for committee. In your written evidence, you also highlighted concerns about how the provisions on valid requests interact with those on time for compliance. Can you explain to committee why introducing the pause mechanism might create an incentive for public authorities to treat unclear requests as invalid?
Yes, I think it's because essentially it pushes them one way. So when you run out of time, you're more inclined to make it invalid as opposed to go for the. So there is the unintended consequence of that.
And with that potential risk, do you still consider the pause mechanism preferable to the current reset approach?
Yeah, I think it is a better situation. I mean, I think we've actually put forward a proposal that was slightly different from that in our consultation response. I think Scottish Government had a similar take on that, where you had a limited period of time for clarification, and then you could use up your time thereafter. So that seems to be, for us, a better way of doing it, but what's in the bill is actually better than what we currently have. So.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful.
Just before you move on from that, one of the things that's come up is the fact that the actual request changes during the period of those 20 days. And actually, what is finally answered is sometimes very different from what was initially asked, partly because some information will have been delivered. How do you see the interaction of effectively what's becoming new requests for freedom of information, the potential risk of the pause being defeated by that, by it being declared a new one and then a new period running?
I mean, I guess there is a risk of that, but it's. I mean, ultimately, if the request has changed so significantly, then it is a new request, and you know it's something that just the FOI professionals will have to work out themselves as to what that. And if people are not happy with it, they can come and speak to us.
Yeah. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just also add to that the proposal that we've put forward is kind of designed to incentivise early clarification, which should hopefully minimise the likelihood of that happening, you know, by encouraging authorities to get the request to the right person early so that they consider early whether clarification is required, which should have a positive impact on all requests, not just those ones where clarification is required, because it's reaching the right person early and allowing to get the ball rolling on that request as early as possible.
Because in your proposed process, effectively the clarification is happening at the start, before any breakdown in relations, before any, you know, being set upon and stuff like that, so that a conversation happens, so there's an actual understanding of what the freedom of information request needs to get to answer the query the individual's raised. Yeah,
it's about incentivising that early consideration so people can start from the outset and also get back to the requester early if they do have any concerns around it, because it is those late stage clarifications that sometimes happen for legitimate reasons, you know, because it doesn't reach the right person until day 15 or 16, or they don't start considering the request until quite late in the process, because it looks easy at face value, but then when they get into it, it turns out that it's not. So incentivising that kind of early consideration by only allowing the clock to be reset within, say, the first 5 working days would have a benefit right across the board, and I think would improve compliance with timescales right across the board as well.
And would it also develop, do you think, the relationship between the requester and the answerer about what the actual problem is, and perhaps continue to support in freedom of information from the public?
Oh, undoubtedly. And certainly when requesters get a late-stage request, you know, often that happens for, reasons that aren't to do with delay, but it looks like delay from the point of view of the requester, which frustrates relationships between individuals and organisations and causes further problems down the line.
Thank you, Paul. Sorry, please.
That was helpful. On the repeal of time for compliance regulations for grant-aided and independent special schools, what are your views on the proposal to repeal the regulations which allow an extension of up to 60 working days for grant-aided and independent special schools whenever the statutory deadline for responding to a request would otherwise fall on a day which is not a school day?
Generally quite sympathetic with it as an equalisation of rights. But, I mean, we are talking tiny numbers here. You know, it's I think was it 3/4 reported no requests last year, and those that did had 1 or 2. So we're talking really, really small numbers here. And I think, to be honest, you could make the same arguments for state schools, because most of the records management and responses are coming from schools, who are also suffering the same challenges.
Yeah, that's helpful. What support is your office prepared to provide organisations that would be affected by a reversion of the 20 working days as a maximum?
None.
No.
No, only.
Fair enough.
I mean,
refreshingly direct. Thank you.
I mean, this is something which we've really factored into the bill in terms of the financial memorandum. There will be a resource requirement from us to do this, to make it successful. And with everything, you're pragmatic about it. It's got to be done in a sensible, and when there's any kind of change, you give people some latitude and deal with this, and that's part of the training, which we would expect to assist in terms of delivering and rolling out.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Sue, can I pass over to you?
Yes, you can. Thank you. I've got some questions on your general functions. There you go. So why do you consider it necessary to have a statutory power to require individuals to provide the information where it's necessary for the Commissioner to perform its statutory functions, such as issuing practice recommendations and handling applications for review?
So I think this is where it can really help add some colour into organisational responses if we're looking at particular issues. It's something which, rather than being in the worst case scenarios when you're blocked by a corporate response, actually wanting to speak to people and understand it fully. I think it's a way of understanding particularly practice issues that happen, that you can get an understanding of that. And again, this is not going to be something that's going to be regularly done, but it's a card to have, and that's important when you have any kind of investigatory function, is that you've got that ability to speak to people. And I think we all had an intervention with Scottish Government, still ongoing, which was to do with some of the roles of SPADs was involved in that. And the Scottish Government was very good in terms of giving us access to that and going in and speaking to these the SPADs. But had they not, then we wouldn't have had that access. And it was really important to get that colour which they could provide, and that degree of granularity which you get in the function, rather than it being washed through a kind of corporate gateway.
Have you got, without obviously understanding there might be some limits of how you can respond to this, can you provide some examples of where the absence of this power has really hindered your ability to improve the FOI practice or conduct investigations effectively? Personally,
no, because I've managed to get through things through other means. Paul, I don't know if you've got any sort of corporate history on that one.
Nothing specific is springing to mind about the absence of that, but we do. As David has said, we do know where we have pursued that. And to be honest, I think it's a power that we would expect not to use particularly regularly, but one that would be helpful to use when there was cause to do so, as there was with the Scottish Government intervention, which, as David has said, gave us some really useful insight into the roles and relationships that led to the sorts of issues that formed the basis of that intervention, and has led to a real significant subsequent kind of these issues being addressed, and the issues that were at the heart of that intervention essentially no longer being of a concern to us. So,
I think the thing of me to add as well, sometimes our relationships with public authorities are not all swimmingly good, and we do get pushback, and we do get some not particularly helpful attitudes and approaches. So having that ability to do that, having it as a backstop at least, is something which I think just reminds public authorities that this is a regulator and that you need to.
So it's not just you as an organisation having that clout; it's having the law to support it?
Yes, and it's being able to do that, and also, you know, if there are issues in there which need to be addressed, then we can address them, because people will be more likely to speak to us personally rather than go through line management.
You're not forcing them, kicking and screaming.
If I could just add as well, you know, we have the power at the moment to issue information notices, which require the supply of information to us. But, you know, not everything that can be helpful for an investigation, you know, exists in recorded information. Sometimes it is the discussion with, you know, an official about the rationale for why a particular action it was taken that can, you know, add, you know, essential additional colour to a particular circumstance.
Okay, thank you. Sticking on that sort of Scottish Government element, we've got Section 13 of the bill proposes to repeal of Section 52 of FOISA, which is the sometimes referred colloquially to as the First Minister's veto power. Okay, so I was wondering, many consultees have viewed that veto power as unnecessary and contrary to the principles of openness underpinning freedom of information. So, what evidence or examples of how late compliance with that decision... Oh, goodness, I'm getting all mixed up here. I don't need to ask you that. Apologies. It's just that my questions are split and I'm getting a bit confused. Okay, so let's move on to the failure to comply with notices. Okay, I'm not needing to ask you about the veto. Apologies. Unless you want to comment on the First Minister's veto being repealed, do you think that's a good thing?
Yes.
Yeah. Is that good for the official report?
Quite seriously, actually, it does drag us down on an international standing, having this.
Okay.
And it's something that we could immediately see an increase in our international standing on this, because and it's never been used. We have dealt with some fairly sensitive issues. Most recently, you'll have seen it's publicised now that the Faz Lane situation, which incidentally would not have been under the veto because it was under environmental information regulations.
Okay.
So it's had its time. It's a safety net, but I don't believe that's required.
Yeah, no, that. Thank you.
Is it fair to suggest that that's one of the examples of a 20-year-old piece of legislation? So when it went in because people were concerned about what freedom of information would look like. Now, as we look back on it, we realise it was an unnecessary belt braces and probably a second belt just to make sure.
I think that's a great way of putting it. It's never been used, and it doesn't need it.
Yeah. No. Thank you. Sorry, Sue.
No, please don't. Thank you for making me look more on the ball this morning. So let's have a look at the failure to comply with notices, because this is about the Section 14 of the bill, amending Section 53 to make it explicit that failure by a public authority to comply with the timescale specified in the decision notice can be referred to the Court of Session for enforcement. Can you provide any examples or evidence of how the late compliance with these decision notices has caused inconvenience or resulted in unnecessary expenditure for your office?
Last week.
Oh, that's a very live one. Please carry on.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is something which it was another frustrated sort of comment in a release which we had to put through, and this was to do with a council, Eastern Bartonshire, let's name them, because they did not comply with instructions of the notice, and they were meant to do it within 6 weeks, as everyone else is, and after another 4 or 5 weeks, they still hadn't complied with that. And it's, you know, we warned them, and eventually said we will report you to the Court of Session. Now, the reality is, by the time we instruct lawyers, get that to the Court of Session, put it through, suddenly it pops out. And it's that, you know, it's one of these really frustrating things. There's no point in us taking that to the Court of Session as soon as it's out, because the offence is not doing so. They're just saying, oh, we're late. This isn't an omission in the drafting. It should have been in at the beginning. It's in the UK legislation. It was just forgotten about. And
okay.
So this is a tidy up to sort it through.
Okay, that's helpful.
I should also add that we would not, just because somebody's late by a few days, we're not going to report someone in the Court of Session. You've got to be pragmatic and sensible with that and in the circumstances. But again, as a backstop, public authorities need to understand that there are consequences for not complying with the law, and they know that they don't have to.
Yeah, so that's fine. I don't need to ask the next question.
That's right. Oh, that's great. Excellent. Rona, can I come to you?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Yes, the first question I have, it was alluded to by Annie Wells, but I'll just tease some more out of it. So it's about the Scottish Government suggested that the new duty to publish, as currently drafted, could require public authorities to publish all information they hold. And so can I ask you in your information what information should fall under that duty? And if you believe that it should be amended to clarify that exempt information should not be subject to publication duty. If you could maybe just clarify that.
So this is the change of the current publication scheme, which everyone says doesn't work. So there's a starting point for 10. What we have doesn't work. So how can we fix this? Now, this is quite an interesting. It's getting quite a lot of interest across the world, frankly, in terms of how this is working, because this is something that's a much more dynamic, a much more flexible way of publicising. Now, in terms of what does that code look like, everyone's asking me, what would that look like? Well, I'm not entirely sure yet, because, frankly, the key thing with this is about getting stakeholders together and finding out what people actually need and want. And part of that is that that public authorities understand what they're being asked for and what they want to put out. Part of this is about finding out what would be useful, what's important. Now, some of this stuff is already in the current model publication scheme, as you would expect. But it allows a bit more granularity on different sectors. It could allow a bit of standardisation. And I think this is another thing which has probably not come out in evidence yet, is the other spin-offs from this. I was looking for an example of this and looked at affordable housing. So currently in a housing emergency, looking at affordable housing, there's not a common definition of affordable housing in Scotland. So there's no way of comparing data across different authorities. And this is something that, as part of an evolving landscape, we can start looking and speaking to different stakeholders and saying, can we agree on definitions on this? And allow people that real ability to compare and contrast how their local authorities and local services are against others. So it's a spin-off mechanism for that.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I ask, has any of that work been started?
No, it's not, and simply because I don't have any resource to do so. This is thinking that we are kicking around just now in terms of what could this look like, and it's this is something that I'm quite clear that it needs to be these stakeholders together on different sectors. I don't think it's going to be a one-size-fits-all. And it's something that when we start getting people together and saying, what are you looking for, and find a way forward. I also think it will be a code of practice can be iterative in terms of it can start off very, very similar to what we have, but move rapidly or slowly, not as slow as other things, but rapidly to a position where it starts to evolve and to reflect what people are looking for, and also allow people to design in on a strategic way into their systems how they do things. Because another example, we talked about AI briefly there. Artificial intelligence is not is being adopted, but it's not being incorporated on an information perspective, and that's a concern for me, because every time you do a generative AI query, you're creating records, you're creating information. And I've yet to hear an AI vendor talking about this. I've yet to hear a public authority talking about this, because people need to start collecting that information, and if people ask for it, releasing it. So this is about design, publication by design, whereby you have your systems and you're starting to show things. So there's a journey here I see where there's probably a short, medium and long term on this. And I think it's actually can be quite exciting for everybody in doing this. And I also genuinely believe that we can start cutting costs in the public authorities, because particularly with live publication of data, it will require less processing in the background.
That's interesting. I'm just curious, is it your office's responsibility to start that work and get stakeholders together to try and change the system?
Under the bill, it would be, yes. So if passed, we would look at that. Certainly, and that's one of the things which we've sort of costed into the memorandum.
So that brings me on to, so what would be the resource implications for your office generally, for this to move?
So we put a fully costed in terms of the staffing for that. I think we said 2 officers initially for the.
I think we did, yes.
For this scheme, to sort of try and develop this and do that engagement work. But again, we've certainly been tight in terms of that. We understand the public sector constraints, and we also understand the fact, particularly that this is as a private member's bill, does not have government funding with it. So we're aware of that, and we've tried to cut our cloth accordingly.
Okay, thank you. Final question, in your view, could the objectives of this proposal, embedding a professional culture, etc., and improving accountability, be achieved through non-legislative measures, such as strengthening the Section 60 Code of Practice? Is there any possibility of that? And what changes would be most effective if that were possible?
I mean, you can hope, but I think we've had 20 years and we still have problems. So I think it just needs a little bit of pushover. I mean, in many ways, the opportunity for that has passed. I would suggest we've done this for 20 years now. We've still got some problems.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so the idea of designating effectively a freedom of information officer within institutions you see as an advantage, as a place to go for you, or a place to go for the public in the first instance. Do you see the benefit in that?
I'm fairly sanguine on it, to be honest. I mean, I think there's the benefit is probably in terms of equality of arms when it comes against data protection. But I mean, I think there's probably it's a role as opposed to a post, if that makes sense.
Yep.
I don't think people need to go start employing lots of different people in these roles because they're probably able to double hat as it is. The benefit is that it starts putting some pressures on, or it gives a clout for the freedom of information function in organisations, and that's something which I regularly see as a problem. And I think I've said in this committee before in my general reports is that the best thing I can do when you see an authority in crisis is to go and speak to the chief executive and start getting some investment in that function. This may start pushing things up the chain a little bit, but I think freedom of information has always been the kind of poor brother to data protection.
Do you think, I mean, I know this is beyond the scope of this bill potentially, but do you think there is something about looking at bringing together record management, GDPR, freedom of information into a combined role to actually give access and stop running up against, or internally within organisations, running up against walls that others are defending?
Yeah, I mean, there's massive crossover. It's like a Venn diagram. So if you're looking at all these different circles, do they converge in one particular role? Again, it depends on the organisation. So, some of the big organisations would struggle with that. The smaller ones certainly wouldn't. It makes sense, and it is. In fact, it's not even an individual post, as I say. It's just a role and a function.
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry, Ron.
Just on a more general point. So, you talk about the changes over the past 20 years. We all agree, etc. But have there been iterative changes throughout that time, albeit in a small way, or have you been able to move with the times a bit? That's really what I'm saying.
When was the code of this Section 60 code changed last?
I think it's about maybe 2016.
Oh,
sorry. So no.
I think maybe 2016 was the last update of the Code of Practice. I mean, over the last 20 years as well, we have taken a slightly different approach to publication schemes, with the Commissioner creating a model publication scheme for authorities to adopt, rather than requiring the submission of individual publication schemes, which created, it took a step towards a sort of a greater degree of standardisation. But I think, as you will know from your evidence sessions so far and the submissions you've received, there's kind of consensus right across the board that just simply, the approach just isn't really working effectively in practice. But we have taken steps to try and improve and try and make things work more effectively.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Thanks, Rona. I suppose a couple of questions to sort of sum up with. David, you talked about AI and obviously the completely changing view, and you rightly point out where AI was at the start of this bill and where it is now is in a very different place. What are your fears about technology effectively allowing the hiding of information? Is that a genuine concern? Is it something we should be worried about? Is it something that this bill can address? or should actually we be a bit more optimistic about it and suggest that potentially new technologies, AI, might in fact make the hiding of data, the hiding of information, an incredibly difficult thing to do?
I guess I'm probably more optimistic on it. I'm sceptical about a lot of AI, particularly in terms of financial savings, but where I see its functional savings are fantastic. There is we are facing a data explosion globally just now, which is just going to get, it's off the scale when you look at where we're going to be. And of course, the problem with freedom of information is you can't release it if you can't find it. So this is where I see AI can certainly be a use, particularly an agentic AI, where you're sitting, you go to a website and it asks a question and it checks data sets and records and comes back with it. That technology exists just now. In fact, it doesn't even need to, you can train it on your own AI on somebody else's public data set. And that's the type of thing that actually allows people to get good granularity of information. The difficulty, again, is going to be standardisation. Because if you're asking about who's got the most affordable houses as a ratio, you're not going to get that because the definitions are different. And I think this is where there's a slight, this where potential here is that we can actually drive better public services and better society using AI, using the publication schemes.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, interestingly, the Law Society in its submission talked about your lack of power with regard to effectively electronic devices, inspection and things like that. And you've already talked about certain areas where things need to basically be tightened up because they were missed or just need tightening up. I mean, have you considered what other powers that you need that this bill may be the vehicle to provide you with? For example, seizure of electronic devices, access to AI databases in California to see what is in there.
I mean, we do have the power of search.
Yeah.
We can get a warrant for that. Something I've explored, but didn't have to use in the end. And again, that's another good example of where there's a backstop that allows to saying that, well, if you don't let us see, then we'll get a warrant, and that's a world of pain for everyone. So I think I'm quite comfortable with that in terms of the information held is information held. There is a difference here between what I need to do in terms of satisfying my function and what you would look at is in terms of a policing investigatory function. Yeah. And I'm quite clear the parameters and differences. I don't feel in any way that there's in terms of interrogation and search, we need to more than what we have beyond what's mentioned in the bill. I think that the ability to speak to people is key. And I also think the enhanced powers regarding the Section 65, which is I think that's a really interesting one. And I think that really merits a comment, if you don't mind me, on that one. And it's just to do with the intent to destroy information. Yeah. And I think that's that I probably want to give some reassurance, as I gave to a conference the other day, that that's a very high threshold to actually show intent to destroy, to evade freedom of information legislation is something that at the moment we've never used the current power. People know it's there, and that's if there's a live investigation. The difficulty, of course, is if there's not a live investigation, you can delete stuff with the intention of evading freedom of information. And that's not a criminal offence. There may be some records management issues with that and some practice concerns, but those are just practice issues. Those are not enforceable. So if we want to be, again, just put that backstop to make sure that people quite clearly understand the parameters, then that's fine. If people are doing, the concern has been about records management and the conflict with this, that we could end up not deleting records. People should have no fear of that, because this is, if you have a records management plan, then there's clearly no intent to do it. You're just following a plan. If you're doing everything normally, and even within records management plan, unless somebody else is going to say they destroyed that because they wanted to get rid of FOI, because I heard them say so, that's the kind of threshold we're talking about here. There are very, very few circumstances. We do get allegations of Section 65 cases where people say somebody's destroyed that as soon as I asked for it. Why do you think that? Well, they just they should have it. Well, that's not good enough. There has to be something. Got to be a smoking gun that actually says, right, hold on, there is something that merits it here. And as I say, we haven't had to do it.
I mean, we have heard concerns about the timings that are proposed within the bill of when effectively the years are triggered, be it from the event or from the investigation. And I think it's, you know, even the most innocent people may think it is a challenge to have a timescale that hasn't started when an event happens, but happens at some future date. What's your view on that?
I think the challenge here is, at the moment, it's time limited,
yes,
quite strictly. And if we look at and I'm going to use the Scottish Government's COVID situation as an example, because in that scenario, it was time barred by the time we got to it.
Mm-hmm.
Everything was timed. There's no offences. Had there been any offences, and I'm be very clear that there are none, had there been any offences, then we would have not been able to take these forward. What my concern here is that this is just the Scottish Government. There are multiple public authorities who are in exactly the same situation who would have had information that they didn't properly record. It just happens to be that the Scottish Government got caught in the spotlight of the COVID inquiry. Had you run that same inquiry across all the other agencies, I suspect you'd find exactly the same practices on that. So this is something which we need to be mindful of, that the time limits do matter. And I think what we currently have is a more pragmatic way of dealing with it, so that if it does come up, then we can deal with it rather than just being time barred, because sometimes these inquiries are years after.
Mm-hmm. So the confidence for the public of having the time not starting until some future date should be that actually the level needed to prove this potential offence is so high that it is only going to be in the most deliberate cases where something has been put beyond the reach of the public with the intent to prevent the public from seeing it, that they can take confidence in having this more elongated timescale, let's put it that way.
No, absolutely. And again, as a former police officer, I understand intent very, very clearly as to how it applies in a criminal situation. And, you know, if you hit somebody and it's an accident, it's not an assault. If you hit them because you want to hurt them, it is.
Yeah.
Now, you know, take that across. It's not. I don't have any difficulty with this, but I think there's a bit of reassurance that needs to get done to the wider
A junior
public.
officer standing by a shredding machine, shredding stuff because they've got umpteen copies of it, has nothing to fear.
No, nothing at all.
Good. My final question, I suppose, is just about the 12 months royal assent, should this bill come to fruition, and do you have any views, particularly with regard to, obviously, Code of Practice on proactive publication, on that time? Would you be able to...
Yeah, I mean, I think the Code of Practice, depending how it lands, but if we do get to a position where it is an iterative position and it's something that can move dynamically, then that's the best way with that, is that we get it up and running, we get it going. And, you know, option one, thinking off the top of my head, would be you just take what you currently have and make that the Code of Practice.
Excellent.
Then you move on, and so on. So, yes, we can do it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your evidence this morning. If there's anything that comes to mind, or indeed that you want to send in, you know how to reach us, and vice versa. And I will call a temporary halt for a change of panels. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, can I welcome everyone back to this, our second panel, and we are joined by Graham Day, Minister for Parliamentary Business and Veterans, who's joined and supported by Jill McPherson, who's Head of the Freedom Information Unit, and Ross Grimley from Legal Directorate. Can I welcome you all to committee this morning? Minister, I understand that you would like to make a brief opening statement. More than happy for you to do that.
Thank you, Convener. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to give evidence on Katie Clark's Freedom of Information Reform Bill today. The government's starting point is that the current Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002 is fundamentally sound, well used, and that there is strong compliance. It ensures a strong and enforceable public right of access to information about the work of government and public services. It also contains safeguards to protect genuinely sensitive information and the resources of public authorities. Whilst similar in form to the UK legislation, our regime is more weighted towards the rights of the requester in a number of respects, so more information is released. That, however, is not to say it is perfect or that it could not be improved upon. FOI law hasn't remained static over the past 20 years. The subsequent 2013 Amendment Act made a number of changes to ensure the law was working well, including changes to make sure the offence of altering records with the intent to prevent disclosure was enforceable and to enable early release of historic records. In relation to coverage, FOISA has also been extended in a number of significant ways in exercise of the existing extension powers held by ministers and approved by Parliament. These include extensions to local authority, Culture and Leisure Trust in 2013, to bodies of various types in 2016, including grant-aided and independent special schools, and in 2019 to registered social landlords and their subsidiaries. I actually led the last of those extensions during my previous time as Minister for Parliamentary Business. 1 year on from designation, 97% of RSLs indicated they were confident in responding effectively to FOI requests. We're now preparing to consult on extension to private and third sector care home and care at home services. I hope these initiatives show the value that ministers have attached to protecting and expanding FOI rights since this government has been in office, taking a proactive approach to enabling provision of information. There is no doubt that fulfilling FOI obligations can place a high demand on resources, particularly of larger public authorities. The Scottish Government is now responding to 6,000 requests per year, some of which can be complex and multiple in their asks. We are currently analysing how much these requests cost us. Initial work on 12 cases suggests that anything between £215 and £3,400. Clearly more work is needed to understand these variances, and that is underway. The Scottish Government is not alone, of course, in seeing rising request numbers year on year, and this is a cost to the public purse. And as we consider reform and improvement of FOISA, we must therefore be mindful of the need to ensure it remains proportionate in its requirements. However, I want to be clear that I highlight this not as a complaint or to appear resistant to change or reform, but to offer a fuller perspective on how FOISA works in practice. Turning to Ms Clark's bill, you will have seen from my memorandum to the committee we have sought to take a constructive approach. We set out where the government agrees with the bill's aims, where we think some of the proposals might be improved, and highlighted the aspects of the bill which the government regards as problematic. However, this is not, of course, a Scottish Government bill, so it's for the member in charge to address any concerns that your Stage 1 report may raise. But I am ready to engage with the committee and wider Parliament, both in the context of the proposed legislation and in a wider sense around how the regime might be improved. Therefore, I and my officials are happy to answer any questions members have today to that end.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that opening, Minister. So would it be right to say that the government now recognise that the time is right for some changes that can only be achieved through primary legislation?
I can't speak for the next Parliament, as you will appreciate, Convener, but I think it would be fair to say that we recognise that there are some areas where, if there was a primary legislation vehicle in the next Parliament, that might be appropriate to use that opportunity to look at where FOISA is working effectively, where things might be tightened up. So without committing the next Parliament or the next government to that, I think there is a recognition that there is perhaps coming a time when that would be useful.
And you have indicated in your opening, and welcome both on behalf of the committee and of course across wider Parliament, the support that the government is willing to provide with regard to assisting with shortcomings in the current bill. Is this not the vehicle to conduct that primary legislative change in?
So I think I think the issue is time. I think the Law Society's touched upon that. The bill was introduced quite late in the session. I think it requires appropriate consideration and, from our perspective, amendment. I would have to acknowledge, and I think you would accept, Convener, that like the Parliament at this stage in its term, the Government's resources are spread quite thinly in terms of activity around bills, both its own bills and members' bills. You'll recall that I committed in the Chamber just a few weeks ago to assist the committee and the Parliament with regard to another bill that sits. I couldn't sit here today and say that we could commit the resources that would be required to amend this bill to get it into the kind of shape I think it would need to be in to be proceeded with. But of course that falls to the committee to come to a conclusion on what should happen with the bill. But I think what this bill does do is it's very helpful in focusing attention on FOISA again, and that if it were to be the case that the bill could not be sufficiently amended or it simply fell because of lack of time, that's not to say it wouldn't be providing pointing a way forward perhaps for the next Parliament. And of course there's always the option for members to bring back the bones of a bill that fell in the previous Parliament.
Who do you think should take responsibility for the vehicle of a Freedom of Information bill? Should it be a member? Should it be the Scottish Government? Should it be the Parliament? Who's the right... Because we've had this discussion about a number of items, particularly those that actually affect and come to this committee for various reasons. And so, really just on behalf of the Scottish Government, who do you think the correct driver of the vehicle should be?
It's a really interesting question, because I think we would all at times reflect on bills and think, well, this is something the Parliament should take a lead on. But as we all know, the Parliament is not resourced up as an institution to take the lead on these things. And that is maybe something for the institution to reflect on going forward. The Government will always seek to assist. And we have a duty, a responsibility to make sure that legislation that is passed by the Parliament is competent and workable. But then there are also the optics where the Government is perhaps seen to be stepping in and then could be accused of, I guess by some people, of protecting its own interests. So we're between a rock and a hard place sometimes as the Government. And I'm hoping my commitments to that previous bill I was referring to, I struck the right balance between trying to offer to assist without appearing that the Government was stepping in, because there are certain areas of the activities of the Parliament legislatively where I don't think it is for the Government to lead on.
No, that's fine. And what is the Scottish Government's view on the balance between what is needed in primary legislation, what's needed in secondary legislation, and actually what's needed in a non-legislative approach to see improvements in the freedom of information world?
Well, I'll bring Jo in a moment because she's leading on this, but we are taking forward a number of matters out with primary legislation. These are carrying on at the moment. So there's, I think, an opportunity to make improvement out with primary legislation. But there are aspects which we may come on to that will require primary legislation. And that's why, I guess, in one regard, if we had more time with this bill, we could have perhaps used that as a vehicle to bring forward some of the changes that we would accept might best be implemented.
I could, I suppose, very sarcastically suggest 20 years is a very long period of time, but I'll not. Jill, can you offer us an insight, particularly, I suppose, into the non-legislative solutions that may exist out there?
Certainly the debate has been around about extension, and in particular to bodies like the care services bodies, the care providers. And while we are aware of little pockets where perhaps an improvement in the law, which would require primary legislation, would be beneficial, I think the thinking has been that the big wins really were in getting that big extension done, and some of the other work that we've been able to effect, rather than pushing on with a large amount of primary legislation.
I think the other thing is it's about culture, isn't it, around it, FOISA. that I think it was the case in the early days that there was a sense in organisations of this is an additional burden, it's an additional ask, and perhaps the mindset of people wasn't as we would have wanted it to be. But I can certainly reflect on my time coming back as Minister, and the attitude and approach from those who deliver FOISA in our own organisation, I would contend is much improved. It is now part of the day-to-day work of the government, and therefore culturally I think it has moved on quite a lot. And that doesn't require legislation.
That requires cultural change. Thank you. Annie, can I come to you? And Annie's joining us online.
Thank you, Convener. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulties here at the moment. Thank you, Minister, for joining us. I'd like to look at the further powers to designate public authorities. And does the Minister and the Government agree in principle that changes in public service delivery models require timely designation of organisations as public authorities under FOISA?
So I guess this goes to that age-old question about how quickly can you designate, and should the whole process be sped up? I have some sympathy for that argument, but if you consider the all of the requirements that are needed to be followed to ensure we get this right, whilst I can understand the frustration perhaps from the outside about the time it takes, much of that time is necessary. But I would certainly be happy to explore how that process could be sped up without compromising it in any way or compromising the robustness of it.
So, just as a follow-on to that, Minister, it's like, do you believe the Scottish Government rejects any suggestion at all that it has been slow to make use of the extension powers?
So I do, and I did in the memorandum that I sent the committee, but I can understand why from the outside people would feel that. But if you take account of things like, since the last additional rollout, which I led on, we've had the pandemic, which had an enormous effect on the activity of government and the activity of the Parliament. And then, of course, in relation to the care sector and the care services, we took a view that the care bill should be in place before we conducted that consultation. And I would defend that decision, but I can understand why people have looked at that and felt it was frustrating that more hadn't been done or more quickly.
Yeah. And on that sort of a memorandum as well, Minister, can you provide an update on the review of the public authorities listed in Schedule 1, please?
I'll bring Jill in on that. Please do.
Yeah, thank you.
This is where I need to find my notes.
Do
you want to tell me where the notes are?
We'll be taking that forward.
It's something that we will take forward. I think that at the moment, our feeling is that the majority of public authorities would already be covered by the measures that are already in place.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. And if there's anything further you want to add later on, then please do come back to us. But the other thing is what is the timetable and scope of the planned consultation on extending FOISA to private and third sector providers of care homes and care at home services?
So I had hoped to be able to say today that would commence next month. It may still commence next month. We are just dotting the I's, crossing the T's at the moment. If it is delayed into early January, that will be because of the advent of the festive season. But we are quite close to getting that done. I can't give you a definitive answer, but I'm happy to write to the committee as soon as we have a date.
Please do.
That would be great. And I've got one sort of a final question, Convener, if I may. This is to do with Section 2.1 of the bill, proposal to require the Scottish Ministers consider recommendations from the Scottish Information Commissioner on designating new bodies under FOISA. And could the Government would the government like to expand on the concerns outlined in its memorandum regarding the proposal to give Parliament a power to designate public authorities under FOISA? And considering those concerns, does the government wish to clarify whether it believes these provisions should be amended or removed from the bill?
Right, so there's quite a lot in there.
There is quite a bit.
So, on section 2.1, we would always consider recommendations made by the Commission in relation to extension, and I think we can demonstrate that to be the case. With regard to the extension to the Parliament, which I think was part of your question, yeah. we do have reservations about it, and I think we went into quite some detail on that in the response to the committee. I mean, I can summarise it if you would like, but I think it's quite well covered there. We're not convinced, for the reasons we've outlined, that is the appropriate way to go. And it is worth noting that the committee the Parliament already has a substantial input to the process, in that this is dealt with under the affirmative process. So therefore there's a balance between Minister's role, the government's role in this, and Parliament, and I think that does strike the right balance.
And sorry, just considering the concerns, do you wish to clarify whether it believes that these provisions should be amended or removed from the bill as well?
We don't believe they're appropriate. We think the current system does strike the right balance.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. Can I just...
Thank you, Convener.
Sorry. Thank you, Annie. Can I just clarify a couple of things? If we look at 2.1, the bill is suggesting that there's a requirement that the government take heed. I presume that the government have no concerns about that, because you've just asserted that you would always listen to the Commissioner on it. So the actual obligation then being come to a requirement, which would then necessitate an obligation on the Scottish Government to respond to it, is not too high a step for the government to take.
So we were talking about a requirement to consider, then we would be relaxed about that.
Ask
but
about
a requirement to be directed is perhaps another matter. But the government do accept that there is not a challenge in being required to consider a proposal from the Commissioner, therefore resulting in a requirement to respond to it. Not
that would be that's fine. Sorry, I'm just going to jump about a bit. Jill, can I just come to you about the public authorities listed? Is the review still ongoing, or has it concluded?
Of Schedule 1?
Yes.
It's still to be, it's not something we have directly looked at. So our focus has been on the care extension.
Right. So there is not a review going on at the moment in respect of Schedule 1. Okay, fine.
But there will be once the care issue is dealt with.
When the space appears, it will happen. I'm just trying to clarify and if there's anything that you want to write with regard to that, that's fine. And then my last part, I suppose, to you, Minister, which is about the proposals to involve Parliament. I mean, the concern is, in essence, that it is taking too long. And I think that the parliamentary suggestion is in part driven by frustration at how long it is taking to achieve this. If Parliament is not the vehicle, how are we going to curtail the length of time it takes to designate? And I mean that in the widest sense.
And it's a fair question, but I would refer you to what I said earlier, that whilst I can understand the frustration about the time it takes, I'm not necessarily sure that the alternative process, and we have some concern about how that would work in practice, would necessarily deliver that along with the robustness that there needs to be. None of us would want to be in a situation where Parliament progress something that it could be challenged on in terms of the groundwork that's laid around the decision to proceed with something, or the robustness of the actual process beyond that. That's the concern that we have. I'm not sure if Parliament was to I use the word robustness again, to have a sufficiently robust process to demonstrate that, frankly, to relieve it of any risk of judicial review, for example. I'm not sure it could do it more quickly. But I get the point about the time it takes.
So is your concern that Parliament couldn't create a process that would stand up in court? Or is it actually a more prosaic one, that the resource that's available to Parliament to undertake that sort of inquiry falls far short of what's available to the Scottish Government to do it?
I think it's a mix of both, Kavira. I'll bring Ross in on this.
Yeah, I think for background, and kind of tried to set this out in the memorandum. So we're looking at section 2.2, which introduces proposed section 5A, which is, it kind of mirrors what section 5 in FOISA currently does, but it's initiated by Parliament instead. Yes. So it's this parliamentary resolution-making process to essentially achieve what section 5 would currently do. I think for background, in our kind of, when we were looking into this provision, this kind of lawmaking by resolution power that is proposed in section 5A is relatively unusual. We were able to find like 4 other instances of kind of legislation making or lawmaking in this method, 4 other statutes on the statute book that do that. I won't list them off, but essentially the thing that they all have in common is that they are typically used to regulate matters of kind of special parliamentary interest, or something that is of a specific, you know, the internal running or administration of Parliament, or something that is of particular parliamentary interest. We don't think that rationale applies here. We don't think that rationale applies here in relation to FOISA. I think the extension of or designation of bodies under FOISA is something with a really strong ministerial interest. It relates to the wider running of government. It relates to the impact on organisations. And typically when we see the Section 5 process happening, it's got quite extensive input from government policy, FOI unit, the business area who understand this specific area. And we think that kind of level of ministerial involvement is essential in exercising the function of extending FOISA. So we don't think that the kind of the parliamentary resolution power would be an appropriate way of achieving. One of
the examples that Parliament looks at is lobbying.
It is, and so the lobbying act. So there's the interests of members of the Scottish Parliament Act 2006. Yeah. There's the Scottish Parliamentary Pensions Act 2009. There's the Lobbying Act, like you say, the Lobbying Scotland Act, and then there's the Scottish Parliament Assistance for Political Parties Act. The Lobbying Act does seem like a bit of an outlier here, right? But if you look at the memorandum of the policy memoranda, the delegated powers memoranda, and the legislative competence note that accompanied it, it's very clear that during the passage of that bill, there was real consideration of should this be a resolution power or should this be an SSI power. And it was considered that it was primarily a parliamentary matter to regulate. Even though there was executive interest in this matter, it was primarily a parliamentary matter, and it weighted more on the side of a parliamentary interest. And because there was other resolution powers in the bill already, they said that for consistency's sake, let's make it all resolution powers, is essentially the approach that is evident from the paper trail. So I agree that the Lobbying Act is an outlier to an extent, but it was still the fact that it was primarily a parliamentary interest that kind of...
But interestingly, it was the government's proposal that it become a parliamentary interest under the lobbying.
Yeah, it was. I take the point about the Lobbying Act, but I don't think that the same considerations about the parliamentary interest and oversight in relation to the Lobbying Act apply in relation to the designation of bodies under FOISA.
So the concern is not that it is. The concern is not based on that it is an unusual vehicle. The Scottish Government's concern is based on the fact that the interest that the Scottish Government would have in the wider sense, you've talked about the freedom of information, you've talked about the cross-policy, is so great that it shouldn't sit with Parliament. It should stay with iterations of updating.
There should be both parliamentary and ministerial involvement in that process,
And it goes to your point about resource, was the word you used. We have that breadth of expertise and input to the process that Parliament currently would not be able to provide.
If I can just come in as well, I think it's really important that in the extension process you're setting up the bodies that are coming in for success operationally and practically thereafter. So it's not just a case of kind of, carving out and saying, OK, it's X, Y and Z. The process that we're going through, for example, with the care organisations is very much a conversation about the size of the organisations, the type of the organisations. We're already, with help from the Commissioner's Office, and through our advisory group, beginning to kind of talk to them about the support that's in place, beginning to build their expectations of what's involved practically for the rollout of FOISA. So it isn't just a case that you get a badge stamped on you saying you're now you're now under the FOISA Act and go and get on with it. I think that the process that we're going through is highly useful in making sure that once the Act does go live, or the extension rather goes live, that it does actually work and it's effective. And I think that our experience with the RSLs really demonstrates the value of that process.
But the reality is, if we compare the Lobbying Act, it's not the Parliament that actually carries forth that integration into the new entities that are deemed to be lobbying. That's carried out by another body. There are others that implement it. I think what we're talking about is the decision point, whether it be, I think as Ross has rightly said, rather than use secondary legislation in that, it's done by way of effectively motion.
It's also done, it also provides the groundwork that makes sure, well, hopefully makes sure that the result of this is successful because of the engagement that there is in the lead up to the FOISA process being completed.
I'm not so convinced that the argument that you're presenting that the Parliament is incapable of doing that preparatory work is perhaps as strong as it's being relied on, but absolutely understand the evidence that you put forward today. Ruth, can I come to you?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. Thank you for the memo that was set in, laying out the position and your opening statement. That was helpful. I have a couple of questions, one about an area where the government is supportive and then another where they're not. In terms of publicly owned companies, the Information Commissioner and the Scottish Government were the only organisations to provide substantive views on the proposal in Section 3 of the Bill for that technical amendment to the definition of publicly owned companies. Are you able to provide examples of companies that would now fall within that revised definition of a publicly owned company?
So we've been doing a piece of work in this, as you might imagine. It is not concluded. But as things stand, there is only one company that we have identified that we believe is captured by that, which is Research Data Scotland. Because it is jointly, the members of the company are Scottish Ministers, Public Health Scotland and a number of universities. Now, I'm not saying that will be the definitive list, but we have identified one. So we recognise there's an anomaly here, and that's why we're supportive of the approach that's proposed in the bill, because it would allow us to address that anomaly.
Okay. I think the fact you've flagged one maybe explains why in the last session we weren't able to get any examples of where that anomaly had actually held up people receiving information.
If we identify others quickly, we will write to the committee with further information.
Thank you, that's helpful. My next question is around time for compliance and that proposal for a pause. Both the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee and the member in charge consulted on that, and responses were positive for that change. I understand the Scottish Government's not persuaded by the need to change the reset mechanism to a pause. Can you speak to that, your views on that, please?
Well, I'll bring the team in because they obviously have got the detailed understanding. I'll talk to it in the...
I think we do understand the concerns that underpin this. And it really is important that if a clarification is required, it is done as early as possible within the handling process. And clearly, if that's not the case, that can cause frustration of requesters, and that is not okay. I don't think that there is systematic misuse of clarification as a delaying tactic. You know, we're not picking that up across the sector as a whole in Scotland, and certainly not, you know, internally within Scottish Government, where of course we've got, you know, quite our own big operation underway. I think occasionally if it happens, it's often because perhaps, you know, something else has gone on, perhaps in the allocation process, or there's, you know, somebody's gone on holiday or whatever, but at a late point, far too late, perhaps they've identified that, you know, the question they're being asked against what they've actually got in terms of perhaps what's coming up in the searches doesn't quite fit. I think it would be really hard to define. I think the kind of putting the pause in could result in unintended consequences, really, in that perhaps, you know, you would have very poor responses going out if that pause had happened quite late in the process. I think there's concern there. But I also think it's very hard to say, well, at what point in the process would you put that kind of pause in?
Okay, if I could go back a bit there, Convener. How does the Scottish Government know that there's not a systematic issue? How are you measuring that?
Simply from our, you know, the fact that we're networked across the country, we're kind of talking to the Commissioner's office and other people who are involved in FOI as well.
So it's sort of anecdotal discussion.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's helpful. Some of the evidence we heard in favour of this was about that sort of perception of trust and people's perceptions, and I think we'd acknowledge that, you know, not every issue is an intentional one, and you laid out an example there of perhaps somebody being absent. We heard quite full evidence from Glasgow City Council, for example, about how they deal with things. Is there not value in putting things in that improve that trust in the system?
If they deliver, if there is a significant issue to be dealt with, and if they don't create practical issues, there is perhaps a lack of knowledge of the processes that organisations will have to follow, particularly with a complex request to ascertain which part of the organisation might hold that information to pull it together. But to your point, absolutely, I can understand if someone is contacted on day 17 and said, can we get further clarification? And perhaps they've started from a standpoint of great concern about this issue, and they will treat that with suspicion. What we're saying is that in a practical sense, there are very often understandable reasons why that has occurred, and we're not aware, anecdotally or through the network of contacts, that there is a significant issue here. And we would just have to ensure that if such a change were to be made, there were no unintended consequences that, for example, might lead to poorer quality answers being provided simply to avoid falling foul of this.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Convener.
Good, thank you. Sue, can I come over to you?
Thank you very much. Good morning, Minister. Section 11 of the bill proposes repealing Section 48A of FOISA, which prevents the Scottish Information Commissioner investigating the handling of information requests by its own office. And you've adopted a neutral position on this. So I was wondering if you'd assessed or reached a position on whether the exclusions for the Lord Advocate and the Procurator Fiscal should also be repealed, and if you haven't, what factors would you need to be able to have a position on that and form a view?
So we have concerns based on legislative competence in relation to the Lord Advocate and the Procurator Fiscals. I'll bring Ross in to perhaps expand on that a little bit for you.
Yeah, just too much to add. I think it's something that we'd have to look at in a little bit more detail. As the Minister mentions, there's legislative competence issues that maybe would need to be considered in a little bit more detail. If it's helpful, that's something that we could set out in more detail too.
I think it would be, because I think it would be helpful to understand why.
I think that's something I'd probably have to submit to you in more detail in writing. It's not something that I'd want to do.
Concerns around the prosecutorial activities of both in terms of legislative competence.
It would be interesting because we got quite a very strong yes from our previous panel as to how these two groups should be included in the legislation.
But you'll appreciate our job is to interrogate the workability of proposals.
Yes, I get that. The other things that, in terms of the codes of practice under FOISA, the enforceability and how effective that would be given the status of the law, could you explain why you consider this to be problematic within the current freedom of information framework, and if the proposals on enforcement notices were introduced, what form of parliamentary oversight do you believe would be necessary to ensure that accountability?
Jill knows all about codes of conduct.
Oh, that's good.
In terms of, the codes of practice, we take the view that the existing codes do play a valuable role in setting standards for good practice. And at the moment, the Commissioner, as we know, can issue practice recommendations. However, allowing the issuance of enforcement notices would be to kind of elevate the codes to the level of enforceable law. And there is, at the moment, a clear distinction between the statutory requirements of FOISA, which are legally enforceable, and the requirements of the codes, which advise on standards of good practice. And it's our view that that distinction has served us well, and that it's also easier to update the codes as we go through. And I think that over periods of time, you've talked about the cultural change, Minister, people have got more used to FOISA, and that the codes of practice, I think are a good way to work with the case handler community in Scotland to maintain good practice.
Have the codes been updated often in the last 20 years?
We're working on one at the moment.
How long does that take you to work on one? Because we did hear some challenges in terms of progress in many ways, and the pace at which things seem to move, I think, were classed as glacial. So I'm wondering how you might want to respond to that.
We are at an advanced stage with that at the moment.
Advanced stage.
We are. I think we're kind of at probably getting towards a final edit stage on it. I think the Minister has kind of outlined some of the kind of challenges that there have been in the landscape over the last few years as well. We're a small team. So we've put a lot of focus over the last couple of years, in particular on the extension, because that was the one that we knew was a kind of public priority. And so obviously some of the work that we're talking about today as well. Okay. But it is progressing. Perhaps you might be able to provide some timelines and things to us. I don't know, it's just for that assurance that we do get a sense that, yes, that there is that progress, that there is an appetite for this to be modernised and brought up to date. Yes. And I think we're in this space where right now everything is not changing at the pace that perhaps the public and members might want to see it happening. So we're just looking for a bit.
And I understand that. And I just give you the assurance that I'm pushing all of this as hard as I can.
I understand you probably are, Minister. I know you well.
But I just make the point that sometimes process takes time to get it right. But my understanding is that it's quite well progressed.
Okay, thanks.
And we can write to you, convener, quickly with some more detail on that.
That's really good as well. So there's also in the section 13 of the bill proposes the repeal of the section 52 of FOISA, which is sometimes referred to colloquially as the First Minister's veto. I'm not quite sure what your position. I think it's opposed to that. But most of the consultees that have come back have said that veto power is unnecessary, and I think we've heard also that it's never been used, and it's really contrary to the principles of openness that underpin FOISA. So why is the Scottish Government believing that it should be retained, even in a limited form, and what risks would arise if the power was repealed completely?
Well, it's important to say this is not a carte blanche power. It is restricted to very sensitive issues. It is extremely narrow. The fact it hasn't been used doesn't mean that it might not be required around issues of sensitivity. And our view on balance is that it should be retained.
We heard in terms of international standings, if this was removed, it would make our Act and our legislation even better in terms of that ranking in the world. What would your thoughts be to not wanting to see that progress?
It's not about not wanting to see that progress.
Apologies for the language.
It's no, not at all. I mean, I get the perspective. People have different perspectives on this. Our position, and people would say, well, you would say this, wouldn't you? But our position is, here is to reflect on the merits of proposals and to work through whether there are any unintended consequences. And just because it hasn't been used up until now doesn't mean, in the world that we live in, national security, for example, there might not be an instance in which this was necessary, and that's why we favour retention.
Convener,
sorry,
can I
just clarify? It's not the only protection that would prevent disclosure of that information. Effectively, the First Minister's veto is the last of a number of walls that have to be go through over how we want to describe it. And it is the very last step of the Scottish Government, who is represented along with the law officers by the First Minister, saying in this occasion, and then reference, my understanding is, it needs to be made to previous barriers that would have prevented the publication. And it has never been used, and it is the outlier on an international stage. I don't know if Ross wants to...
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to just reiterate what the Minister has already said. I think that, first of all, I think it also, in terms of the attitudes towards openness and transparency, I think the fact that it hasn't been used also, I think, demonstrates the fact that, this isn't something that we're willingly, we're not overly keen to use this veto power to stop transparency. And I think you're right, it's part of a suite of protections against releasing information. But in the same way that all of the other methods under FOISA for either disclosing or withholding information are subject to judicial scrutiny, as is the First Minister's veto power, it's been made clear previously that the First Minister's veto power isn't immune from judicial challenge either. So it's not that it it's not above the law. And if the First Minister's veto power is used, that still will be subject to scrutiny and could be challenged equally in the same way that the rest of FOISA could be, and the other measures under FOISA could be challenged.
I think because of the nature of us as an organisation, it just recognises that from time to time there is highly sensitive information which we may occasionally hold just because of the unique nature of being the Scottish ministers. But
that sensitive information is already protected.
But this is a layer of the overall protection. What I would also
this is belt and braces.
Yeah, what I also say, is very often when the Parliament's dealing with legislation, we look at future-proofing it. We kind of try to guess what might come down the track and not bind ourselves. What I'm saying here is that having that veto does future-proof the situation, because there could be something further down the line that requires us to use it when we haven't used it until now. So it's almost like future-proofing it.
For that exact reason, the committee is asking itself, as we try and future-proof or look to future-proof, subject to the Chamber's decision with the bill that's before us at the minute, a situation where a First Minister might use it, and then the only remedy an individual would have, as you say, Ross, is to take effectively the First Minister to court to judicially review the process of using that First Minister's veto, potentially having had to already do that under, say, national security, under, any of the other exemptions. And actually, it's one of the few areas in this bill where actually the responses that we've had have been overwhelmingly articulated as, this has existed from day one, it's never been used, we don't think it's necessary. But also, from the point of view of a statement being made by the Scottish Government to the people of Scotland, that they understand rightly that there is some information that cannot be disclosed for extremely good reasons. But that power is never going to just sit with the First Minister. There are wedges, there are layers before that, and I just wonder whether the look of it is talking to what we've talked about with the pause, what we've talked about with people who fail to get the information they think they're entitled to or they think exists, that this is something that actually it's the Scottish Government that are on the outlier with it. And I understand the reasons that it's being argued, but maybe can I just suggest think again or consider it again?
I think what we said in our response was we weren't fully persuaded by the proposal. I understand the rationale for it. I'm simply putting the counter-argument, which probably reflects why we're not persuaded at this stage by it. Okay. But clearly that's a matter for the committee to take a view.
Absolutely. Sorry, Ruth, you wanted to...
Thank you, Convener. Just briefly, Minister, it might be helpful to understand, and the power's never been used. It might be helpful to understand when I think about my constituents looking at the sort of headline of this, you know, what sort of occasion might it be used?
Well,
help them to understand why it's needed.
Well, given it's never been needed, it's hard to come up with a precise example, but I think I mentioned earlier something in the space of national security would be an example.
International relations, perhaps investigations by Scottish public authorities.
Okay.
Correspondence with the royal family. Correspondence with the royal family.
Couldn't possibly comment.
All of which have protections already.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, Ruth.
Sorry.
Sue, did you? Oh, no problem. Excellent. Rona, can I pass over to you?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. The Scottish Government stated that it cannot support the proposals as currently drafted. I wonder if you could summarise the main reasons for that, and of the issues that have arisen, do you think they could be amended in any way, or are there more fundamental objections to the bill?
So I think in our response via the memorandum, we've identified the areas of concern that we have. So cumulatively, in its current form, we couldn't support it. But it comes down, our support aspects of it. I guess it then comes down to something we touched on earlier about the amount of time we have in which to address these concerns. I think the bill, from our perspective, and I don't just mean that from the perspective of the government as the government, but in terms of trying to ensure that legislation that's passed is workable and appropriate and fit for purpose. We don't have a lot of time in which to address those. And as I said to the convener previously, our resources are spread very thin with so many bills on the go, a lot of SSIs in play and coming into play, that we would have the time to address that in the remainder of the Parliament. But clearly, if the bill is recommended to Parliament, it passes at stage 1, we will do our bit to work with the member, with the members willing to work with us on that and to explore that, to ensure as best we can that anything that comes forward to the Parliament at stage 3 is as workable as possible.
Thank you. That's quite clear. I just wanted to move on a wee bit to the issue of destruction and retention of records, etc. Is the government considering similar measures in its revision of the Section 60 and Section 61 Codes of Practice? And I'm not sure if that's what you were referring to earlier, Ms Macpherson, when you talked about you were already working on issues regarding Code of Practice. So just to find out if that's maybe an area you're looking at.
In our draft of the Section 60 Code revision, we certainly have improved guidance within that on the searching of records and the searching process, which is very important for identifying potential information for release. In terms of the Section 61 Code, we're currently under an intervention related to records management from OSIC, which kind of follows the WhatsApp sort of debate. And really we're waiting for the outcome and for that intervention report to kind of then consider our options for a review of Section 61. Okay, and do we have any timescales on that, or is it just a work in progress? Ask the Commissioner. We are awaiting his moves.
I understand. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just to be clear,
please, Minister.
It's not that we're placing the burden back on the Commissioner at all. I want to be clear about that. It simply is logical to await his final report, to understand if there are any implications or any read across from that report that should inform what we progress. That's all it is.
Yeah. Thank you, Rona. If I just go back to the concept in the bill of a movement to proactive publication, and you set out your response to it and the concerns about it. Would the government support it if it was specified through secondary legislation or guidance, a limitation to the specific information that needs to be proactively published? or indeed if it was looked at the other way and there were very clear exemptions as to when proactive publication wouldn't. So I suppose I'm asking, could a process shift the view of the government on its stance to moving to proactive, not the government, but institutions moving to proactive publication?
So where there was greater clarity in what was in scope?
Yes, yes.
I guess the answer to that is potentially. And one of the concerns we've expressed is that it's not defined, it's very wide-ranging. If there was some specificity delivered on that, then that might address our concerns.
So it's not the cultural stance that proactive publication is wrong. It is actually the reality of understanding what is, and possibly more important, what is not covered in it may change the view of the government, or may move the stance of the government towards that.
I think that's a fair. I think that's a fair assessment as an organisation that's actively in the proactive space. So yes, I think that's a very good summary.
That's very helpful. Had you finished? No, please, Jill.
A little. I think that the part of the issue around about proactive at the moment is, I think we all acknowledge that the current schedule is out of date,
yes.
But there is probably a lack of there probably is a lack of clarity about what is expected here. But the reality is that what we would, each of us as a public authority would need to proactively publish varies enormously across the size and type of the organisation. And in fact, we were at a conference just a couple of days ago where I was sitting alongside somebody from a university, and her experience of what she was being asked and the information she was proactively publishing, the routes that she was proactively publishing that, were worlds away from my particular experience. So I suppose that wherever we get to in this debate, it needs to be flexible enough to really work for individual authorities and their customers, their stakeholders, and just to recognise the breadth of interest and the breadth of volume within that as well. I think the other issue that, and this is one which is covered by some research work which our sister team, the Open Government team, are involved with, looking at kind of setting up a standard for proactive publication across Europe. There is also there is an implementation burden in there as well, and we just need to consider that in the mix as well, to get the balance right between how much we're putting out in volume and whether that's the right thing and the right volume of information for an organisation's particular customer group, but also the cost of doing that as well. But there will be a happy balance somewhere in there.
It's almost the same questions that were being asked 24, 22 years ago before the first legislation of what freedom of information means. And I think you summed up nicely, Jill, in that there needs to be a balance there.
Yes, and it is a matter of prioritisation, isn't it, at the end of the day? Yeah,
absolutely. Just before I bring in Katie, Minister, I've got just a couple of questions, which is really about the change in the technological field between even the start of this bill, but certainly over 20 years, and in particularly if we look at some of the AI that is available now, that we are potentially entering an area where artificial intelligence, the ability to mine publicly available data, the ability to mine data that may exist in one organisation in the public form but not the others, may well take us in, if we're optimistic, strides forward in the freedom of information and what is available. I think of instances where cases over whether councils knew about potholes, whether freedom of information suggested they only knew in one department once, and then AI suggested actually there were 20 different departments knew about the same pothole. There is there is technology that is making available information actually that isn't connected within organisations. I mean, what's your sort of view of how we encompass that in the changing world of FOI going forward?
Well, thanks for that question.
It's an easy one to finish with from me.
It is a fascinating question. And I guess that perhaps goes to the point about what the next Parliament does and how it perhaps takes forward legislation, which could quickly be overtaken by AI in a variety of ways. But you're right. I mean, the ability to access information could change completely, courtesy of AI. It could be a much simpler process. And there's no doubt, I would think, that would inform the view of government and Parliament about the future expansion of FOISA.
But you're still confident that the definitions and understanding of what freedom of information means over the last 20 years is at a level, is robust enough so that as we go forward, those top-level understandings of what we mean by freedom of information, we can rely on actually what's going to change is the technology that gives access to it. Would that be fair?
Yes, it would be fair. And I would hope that the instinctive resistance that you sometimes encounter to further rollout is addressed by the experience of RSLs. So it's human nature to say, not for us, too much work, lot of burden, but actually the evidence of the RSLs, because I remember well their resistance to that the figure I quoted earlier about within a year, it was not the problem that they expected it to be. And I think we jointly, all of us who are in support of FOISA, need to promote that message. This is a good thing. It's right that it's there, and we should expand it, and that the concerns that are expressed, albeit smaller organisations, burdensome, all of that should not be fearful of being captured by it.
That there is a value in freedom of information. Thank you. Thank you for your patience, Katie. Can I hand over to you?
Thank you very much. And Minister, as you are probably aware, this bill has been drafted on the basis of work over a number of parliaments, a number of consultations, the work of this committee in the previous parliament, the recommendations coming from all 4 information commissioners over quite a period of time since the 2002 Act, the views of stakeholders such as FLI officers at events that I know you attend who, for example, are asking that they be given a statutory footing similar, in fact mirrored on data protection to give them more authority to enable them to require their organisations to comply with the law, campaigning organisations and many others I could list. So it's an attempt to capture discussions that have been taking place over a long time. So do you accept that the reason that we have this bill today and that we're discussing it is as a result of the failure of Scottish governments to respond to these calls for reform, and most recently to the post-legislative scrutiny report in 2020 and after the consultation in 2003, and that therefore there is a lack of confidence that the Scottish Government is driving or will drive the changes that are needed?
So I mentioned the word perspective earlier. Everyone has a perspective on these things, and there are people who will want to see FOISA rolled out far more widely than it has been. There are people who are rightly coming to a view on what they would consider to be shortcomings. I've acknowledged that there are shortcomings in this, and I've also acknowledged that from my viewpoint, I get the frustration that the pace, I wouldn't accept it as glacial, but the pace is not what some people would want it to be. But I've also outlined the process that has to be followed here to make sure we get it right. What I think this bill has usefully done is brought back into focus FOISA, and it has aired, or it is airing, more accurately, the concerns that people hold. And as I said earlier, because of the lateness of the introduction and the parliamentary calendar, it may be that it times out. That may be what happens. But I would like to think that what it has aired can at least contribute to, if not form, the basis in part of what the next Parliament does in terms of addressing the issues that we've identified. Your bill is identifying, accepting that there will be different viewpoints on some of the proposals, as we've heard today, and that I think we've been clear in the memorandum. We don't rule out the possibility or the need for further legislation going forward. As the convener has alluded to very eloquently, the AI issues is an example. What does the AI do? Does it make this easier to implement, etc., etc.? So I think the bill, I'm not being critical of the bill, I think the bill has been very useful, but our job, and sometimes it paints us as being very negative and resistant to things, Our job is to look at the practical application of some of these, to look at the unintended consequences and to help Parliament interrogate that and come to the appropriate conclusions.
Thank you. And I appreciate the evidence that you've given today in relation to the work that you personally have been involved in extending FOI. I appreciate that you're only back in this role again.
9 weeks.
Yes, very recently. But do you accept that there's also a great deal of concern about the pace of designation since 2002, particularly given the changing nature of how public services are delivered without sourcing, which on occasion, as we've heard in evidence, has led to a loss of rights? We've obviously been taking evidence today in relation to changes, technology. Also, the Scottish Parliament designated 10,000 bodies in 2002 when the Act was passed, but as we've heard since then, the pace of designation has been described as glacial. So do you accept that we need to speed up the pace of designation given the loss of rights, and the public have a right to know how their money is being spent?
So to be clear, if we're talking about, do I understand the frustration that we have not progressed matters at greater pace? I understand the frustration, but as I've outlined previously, the process is there for a reason. And do I think it's clunky? Yes, I do. Do I think it takes too long? Yes, I do. But we don't want, I would contend, to go the other way, where we just willy-nilly designate and it creates difficult for us. So there's a balance to be struck here. And we're certainly willing to explore what that balance would look like.
So, as I said, we designated 10,000 bodies in 2002, and they were often similarly complex. So the question really was, do you not accept that we need to speed up the pace of designation?
We have to be clear. So the process that follows determines whether the initial look at a body and all elements of it is actually confirmed by the activity that takes place, to make sure that every aspect of its work's captured. I'm trying to choose my words carefully, because I get very frustrated by process convener at times. I would like to see this and other things move more quickly. So I do accept that there is a discussion to be had here about how the process is developed to move more quickly, but it has to maintain its integrity.
But many of the bodies that were designated in 2002 are complex, and, for example, GP practices, a wide range of different bodies. And the essential point I'm making is that we need to speed up this process, don't we?
And I accept that, but what I would say to you is that this is the Parliament. It has a responsibility to make sure that there are not unintended consequences about the practical application of what it may at first glance have considered to be an appropriate way to go, if that makes sense. So I'm just saying that there's a balance to be struck here, and I think we need to, that balance needs to shift perhaps from where we are currently. I accept that, but we must at all times ensure that it's appropriate, the action that we take.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you.
And can I thank Jill and thank Ross for attending committee this morning. I know you're going to write to us, and we know where you are, you know where we are. So can I thank you for your evidence today, and I will now close the public part of this meeting. Thank you.